KTM's PDS obsession. In 1997, KTM built 133 copies of a limited edition bike called the Jackpiner. Blue paint, John Penton's signature on the fender, and Öhlins shock bolted directly to the swing arm with no linkage between them. 133 bikes, a commemorative model. Nobody was supposed to take it seriously as an engineering statement. KTM kept that system on their bikes for the next 14 years in motocross. That's the PDS system. How linkage actually works. By 1996, every major dirt bike manufacturer on Earth used a linkage rear suspension. Honda called theirs ProLink. Kawasaki called it Unitrack. Suzuki ran the full floater. Yamaha had their own rocker arm setup. Different names, but identical physics. The shock on a linkage bike doesn't connect directly to the swing arm. It connects through a rocker arm, sometimes called a bell crank, mounted low on the frame. The swing arm pushes one end of that rocker. The shock absorbs from the other. As the wheel travels up and the suspension compresses, the geometry of that rocker changes the leverage ratio between the wheel and the shock. Early in the stroke, small square edges, chatter, braking bumps, the mechanical advantage is high. The shock sees less force than the wheel actually received. That makes the bike feel compliant and plan it over small hits. As the wheel travels further, big landings, jump faces, heavy braking into a corner, that leverage ratio shifts. The mechanical advantage decreases, and the shock has to work harder per millimeter of travel. The effective spring rate climbs. This is a rising rate system. The spring doesn't change stiffness. The geometry does the work. One spring, two behaviors. Soft enough for small bumps early in the stroke, stiff enough to resist bottoming when the big hits come. That's the whole engineering brief. 4 separate teams at 4 separate companies landed on the same answer inside the same decade. That level of convergence doesn't happen by accident. What PDS actually is. PDS stands for Progressive Damping System. The progressive in that name refers to the internal shock valving, a needle engaging a twin piston design that increases damping resistance as the shock compresses deeper into the stroke. What PDS does not have is a linkage. The shock mounts directly from the swing arm to the frame. Wheel moves, shock compresses, 1-to-1. The first one was that Öhlins unit on the Jackpiner. Within a year, KTM had rolled the system across most of their production lineup using WP shocks. White Power, the Austrian suspension manufacturer that KTM's parent company Pierer Mobility would eventually own outright. That ownership matters. We'll come back to it. To get any rising rate behavior out of a direct acting shock, you have 2 tools. Progressive wound springs wound tighter at one end so they stiffen as they compress, and internal valving tuned to resist oil flow increasingly as the stroke deepens. KTM used both. The PDS shock is also physically longer than a linked shock on a comparable bike, which increases oil volume inside the body and helps manage heat during sustained riding. That heat management detail is more important than it sounds, but only in specific conditions. Why it works in Enduro. Here's where KTM's decision makes real engineering sense, and you have to respect it. Enduro is not motocross. You are not hitting the same set of whoops 12 times a lap. You are riding rocks, roots, steep loose descents, creek beds, and forest single track, terrain that throws irregular, unpredictable hits at the suspension with no pattern and no warning. In that environment, suspension response time and mechanical reliability matter more than rising rate characteristics. A linkage system adds pivot points. Every pivot point is a bearing. Every bearing needs to be greased and maintained on a schedule, or it wears and the whole suspension system goes vague, mushy, unpredictable, dead feeling through the stroke. In a hard enduro or a 6-day race, you are fighting mud, sand, water crossings, and hours of sustained abuse. You are often a long way from a bench press and a bearing kit. PDS has fewer moving parts, fewer bearings, fewer failure points, fewer things that go wrong on day 3. The suspension response is also more direct. There is no mechanical delay through a rocker arm, no play from worn linkage joints. In rocky sections where the wheel is taking rapid, irregular hits, the shock is responding in real time because it's right there. KTM EXC and Husqvarna TE bikes running PDS won World Enduro Championships. They podiumed at Erzberg. They finished Dakar. These results happened on the system while the critics were calling it compromised. For Enduro, in Enduro conditions, the argument was legitimate. The first warning. Jeremy McGrath. But motocross is not Enduro, and the clearest proof of that arrived in 2002. Jeremy McGrath, 7 AMA Supercross titles, 72 career wins, the most dominant Supercross racer in history, left Yamaha at the end of the 2002 season and signed with KTM for 2003. At the time, this was a genuine statement of faith in the brand. If the king of Supercross was on your bike, the bike was supposed to be capable of winning Supercross. He never gelled with it. Specifically, he never came to terms with the PDS rear suspension. Under the lights on a Supercross track, manufactured dirt, precise rhythm sections, jump faces, and whoops built for the exact kind of riding where rising rate behavior matters most. the PDS suspension's handling characteristics didn't work for the way McGrath rode. He crashed hard at a preseason test, dislocated his hip, and announced his retirement before the first round of the 2003 season. People have softened the story over the years. Injuries, contract disputes, the bike not being ready, all of those things were also true, but multiple people inside KTM's own camp confirmed at the time he never came to terms with the bike, and the part of the bike he couldn't come to terms with was the rear suspension. The greatest Supercross rider alive couldn't make PDS work in Supercross. If that doesn't tell you something about the application mismatch, nothing will. Why KTM held the line anyway? So why didn't they change it immediately? Start with ownership. KTM owns WP. When every KTM runs PDS, every KTM runs a WP shock. A WP shock built to a proprietary geometry that doesn't easily accommodate a different brand's unit. A standard linkage system with a conventional shock mount lets riders replace the stock shock with an Öhlins, a Showa, or a factory-spec aftermarket unit. PDS is a closed ecosystem. The geometry is specific to the shock length and mounting position. That keeps more riders inside the WP product line, and WP is part of the same company. Then there's the race program. KTM's identity through the 2000s was built on off-road results, Enduro World Championships, GNCC, desert racing. Their marketing ran on those wins. And on the bikes those wins happened with, PDS was still working. When your podium shots are all coming from terrain where the system is genuinely well-suited, the pressure to change doesn't feel urgent from inside the building, and there's something harder to quantify. The organizational identity of a brand that prides itself on not doing what everyone else does. KTM introduced orange at a time when every other MX brand was white or red. They ran steel frames when the Japanese went aluminum. They kept carburetors on off-road bikes longer and then went full EFI with TPI two-strokes when the industry didn't see it coming. Sometimes that contrarian engineering culture produces genuine innovation. Sometimes it produces entrenchment dressed up as conviction. The tipping point, Roger DeCoster, 2011. In late 2010, KTM hired Roger DeCoster to manage their pro motocross team. DeCoster had built the Honda dynasty, he'd managed the Suzuki dynasty, he understood what a motocross bike needed to do at the highest level better than almost anyone alive. The 2011 KTM had linkage-style rear suspension. The 2010 model, the year before DeCoster arrived, was the last PDS motocross KTM. Whether that was a coincidence or a direct consequence, the outcome was the same. From 2011 forward, KTM split their lineup deliberately. Motocross bikes got linkage, off-road and enduro bikes kept PDS. The SX and SXF models were redesigned around a conventional linkage setup. The XCW and EXC models stayed on PDS. And almost immediately, the comparison tests on the MX bikes shifted. Mid-stroke compliance improved. Setup became more intuitive for a wider range of riders. Bottoming resistance came from the geometry, not exclusively from valving art. The bikes got easier to tune. 14 years after the Jackpiner, 1 year after the most respected team manager in the sport walked through the door. The AER parallel. If you want to understand how KTM's engineering culture operates, the AER air fork tells the same story. In 2016, KTM replaced the steel spring in the front fork with an air spring system, the WPA-ER. Air springs can produce a rising rate curve without swapping hardware. They save weight. The concept was sound. The execution needed years of development. Riders complained about pressure sensitivity, setup complexity, and real-world maintenance demands that steel springs don't have. KTM didn't abandon it but developed it, refined the internals, rebranded it as the XACT system from 2020 onward, and kept pushing. That's a different outcome than they gave up. It's a company that commits to an engineering direction and develops through the criticism rather than around it. The XC cross-country models dropped the air fork for 2024, moving to closed cartridge spring forks. The SXF lineup has kept air spring technology, still developing. Same pattern as PDS. Commit hard, absorb criticism, develop through it. Eventually, the application dictates which direction you go. The 2027 ending nobody saw coming. Here's where the story stops being about engineering stubbornness and starts being about financial reality. In late 2025, credible reporting from inside the enduro racing world indicated that the 2027 KTM EXC, the enduro bike, the last stronghold of PDS, is expected to drop the system entirely and move to linkage across the board. The reason isn't that anyone inside KTM finally decided the engineering case was wrong. The reason is that KTM's parent company went through serious financial problems in 2024, came out under new majority ownership from Bajaj, the Indian manufacturer, and the new owners are rationalizing production. One frame platform, one swing arm design, one rear suspension architecture across all models, manufacturing a separate PDS-specific swing arm, frame section, and shock geometry for the Enduro line, while the motocross line runs linkage, costs money that the company currently doesn't have the luxury of spending. After nearly 30 years, PDS may be ending not because the debate was resolved, but because the balance sheet spoke louder than the engineering argument. The verdict: PDS was the right architecture for Enduro. Simpler, more durable, more directly responsive to irregular terrain, lower maintenance burden in the field. The race results across 3 decades of Enduro competition backed that up. PDS was the wrong architecture for motocross. Rising rate behavior from linkage geometry, better mid-stroke compliance, easier tuning for a broader range of riders. 14 years of MX riders asking their suspension tuners to compensate for the system's limitations backed that up. Jeremy McGrath backed that up. Roger DeCoster showing up, and the suspension changing the following model year backed that up. KTM knew the Enduro argument. They let the Enduro wins provide cover for the motocross bikes longer than the data justified. They built an identity around the system, tied their suspension supply chain to it, and held the line until the competitive pressure, in the form of a legend who couldn't win on it, and then the right manager walking in the door, finally shifted the MX bikes in 2011. The Enduro bikes held for another 14 years after that. They may finally go linkage in 2027, not because KTM changed their mind, but because they ran out of runway to keep building 2 different answers to the same question. That's not just engineering, that's what happens when identity, economics, and performance data finally all pull in the same direction at the same time. You just spent 10 minutes on one suspension system on a production bike. Factory bikes don't have that argument. Every single component is custom built for one rider, one season, and one purpose. The shock alone costs more than most people's first dirt bike. That breakdown is next.